When the HOA decided to charge me $500 for fishing off my own dock, I realized everything I thought I understood about this community was about to be turned upside down. That realization hit the very moment I opened my front door and found an official-looking envelope taped there, stamped with the bold letters HOA in the top corner. The fine felt like a personal attack, but more importantly, it signaled the beginning of a conflict that would eventually consume my life. I had no inkling just how far this would go or how many neighbors would end up entangled in it, but right then and there, standing on my porch with my teenage daughter peering over my shoulder, I sensed this was more than a simple dispute over lake usage. It was about power, greed, and a bizarre strain of tyranny disguised under the banner of an association meant to maintain harmony. I'm Ethan Barlow. I'm 42 years old, a widower and father to 14-year-old June, who stood beside me that morning, still dressed in her pajamas. We had moved to Lakeshore Green 7 months earlier, drawn by the promises of a tranquil lakeside community, an oasis where I hoped we could rebuild our lives after my wife passed away from cancer. Fishing had been our family's favorite pastime. Even in my wife's final days, we would sit at a small pier near her hospital whenever she had enough energy, letting the gentle motion of the water soothe our worries. After she was gone, fishing became my way of staying close to her memory. June also found comfort in it, as if every cast were a link to moments shared with her mom. But apparently that tradition was unacceptable here, or at least unacceptable in the eyes of a certain woman named Karen. She chaired the HOA like a private fiefdom. From my early observations, she ran the place with a strange combination of relentless micromanagement and selective enforcement. Rules that served her interests were upheld stringently. Any guidelines that might inconvenience her associates were conveniently overlooked. The moment I tried to fight back, I discovered how systematically she had woven her network of allies, both within the neighborhood and at higher levels of local government. That morning, as I read the letter in disbelief, June asked, "Dad, are we really in trouble for fishing?" I skimmed the text, which cited some newly passed regulation banning recreational fishing on the community lake. The letter claimed that the HOA board had voted unanimously to impose a fine for each violation, starting at $500. My first reaction was confusion. Our realtor had said fishing was not only allowed but actively encouraged. The original bylaws supported that. So I set the paper aside, trying to reassure my daughter with a dismissive wave, telling her there must be some misunderstanding. Half an hour later, I stood outside, looking across the street at the neighbors' neatly trimmed hedges. Since we moved in, I'd mostly kept to myself, focusing on my job as a freelance financial consultant and helping June adjust to her new school. I realized, though, that if this fishing ban wasn't some bizarre mistake, I'd need to figure out how such a rule had taken hold without most residents even knowing. I saw a woman in tennis shoes and a visor pushing a visi stroller along the sidewalk. When I asked if she knew anything about a new fishing ban, she just shook her head and mumbled that she never read the emails anyway. It was clear she had no idea. That lack of awareness seemed to be exactly what Karen was counting on. My next step was to knock on the door of a retired teacher named Jerome, who lived 2 houses down. I'd met him briefly when we moved in. He was gracious and well-informed, though somewhat private. I felt he might at least have some insight into the HOA. When he opened the door and saw me holding the violation notice, he sighed. "You too?" he asked, beckoning me inside. He confessed that Karen had recently pushed through a flurry of amendments to the association's guidelines under the pretense of preserving the environment. She framed it as preventing pollution from fishing lines and hooks, and I guess she got enough board members to vote with her, he explained. But half of us never knew there was a vote at all. Jerome warned me that Karen was tenacious, unafraid to dish out harsh fines. You can try appealing, but that usually goes nowhere. She's got friends on that board. He pointed to the thick binder of HOA documents he kept on a shelf. I've been thinking about moving because it's only gotten worse over the last year. You'd be surprised how many families have been encouraged to leave. The moment they voice dissent, it's fine after fine until they can't handle the harassment. Hearing that felt like a punch to the gut. I'd sunk most of my savings into our new house because I believed this neighborhood was perfect for June and me, a place where we could quietly start over. It angered me to learn there was someone using bureaucratic tactics to weed out families who didn't bend to her will. Before I left, Jerome handed me a slip of paper with the phone number of another neighbor, Marcia, who had also clashed with Karen. Marcia's got kids too, and she's not shy about speaking her mind. If anyone else has an axe to grind with the HOA, it's her, Jerome said. I thanked him, then walked home, trying to figure out how to break all of this to June. She was still reeling from her mother's death. The last thing I wanted was more turmoil, yet I knew I had to stand up for something that felt so fundamentally right. The freedom to fish in a lake we all paid HOA fees to maintain. Later that evening, I discovered an email from the HOA board in my inbox, reiterating that I was in violation. They spelled out that I had 2 weeks to pay the fine or face additional penalties, including a lien on my property. The tone was disturbingly smug, as though they assumed I wouldn't dare contest it. At the bottom, there was a signature block with Karen's name in large bold letters, underscoring her role as the HOA president. I sat at my desk, reading it again and again. My first impulse was to write a scathing reply, but I refrained. Instead, I typed out a simple response. I respectfully request official documentation of the alleged rule change, including the date and manner of the vote by the HOA membership. I hit send, fully anticipating they might ignore me. Then I called Marcia. She picked up on the third ring. Her voice carried the distinctive energy of someone who'd been through similar nonsense before. "Fishing ban, right?" she said as soon as I mentioned my name, and her tone held a mixture of anger and resignation. Apparently, her teenager had been fined for skating in a common area walkway, labeled as vandalism under a newly minted rule that kids could not use rollerblades or skateboards on HOA sidewalks. Marcia told me she had tried to gather support from neighbors to challenge the rule, but Karen manipulated meeting agendas and quashed any attempts to discuss the ban. She's got a small circle of loyalists on the board. It's like she's systematically controlling everything, Marcia explained. And if you rub her the wrong way, she finds something to fine you over. Yard decorations, trash can placement, even the type of car you drive, she spins it all as part of protecting property values. Marcia's frustration mirrored my own. She warned me not to escalate too aggressively unless I had a clear plan. She'll retaliate, trust me. I realized I needed more information, so I spent the next 2 days diving into the official HOA bylaws posted on the association's website. Sure enough, the original set of rules stated that fishing was allowed for residents, as long as they followed basic environmental guidelines. But in an addendum labeled Amendment 14E, an entire paragraph declared the immediate prohibition of fishing activities to preserve the natural shoreline and aquatic habitats from potential hazard. The date on that amendment was only 3 weeks old. It referenced a board vote with little detail on how many members voted or how residents were notified. It felt hastily added, and everything pointed to Karen's orchestrations. On Thursday, I decided to attend the upcoming monthly HOA meeting, hoping to get clarity or at least question the process. I let June know I'd be home late and asked her to prepare dinner for herself. She agreed, but cautioned me not to pick a fight. I wanted to assure her that everything would be fine, but inside I was bracing for a battle. I had no idea what shape it would take, only that I was marching into Karen's territory, where she clearly reigned with an iron grip. The meeting was held in a small function room within the community center. About 20 people were scattered around, though the neighborhood had well over 100 homes. Most seats were unoccupied. At the front sat Karen, a woman in her early 50s with impeccably styled hair, wearing a blazer that screamed authority. 2 men and another woman, presumably board members, flanked her. I slipped into a chair near the back, noticing how even the arrangement of seats seemed designed to discourage open dialogue. The setup had the board at a table facing the audience, as though we were there to witness, not to participate. Karen called the meeting to order, running briskly through a few agenda items about landscaping contracts and an upcoming social event. After about 10 minutes, she announced that the floor was open to resident concerns. My heart thumped. I stood up and introduced myself, then asked, "Could you elaborate on the new fishing ban in Amendment 14E? I'd like to know when the board voted on it and how residents were informed ahead of time." Karen tightened her lips, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Mr. Barlow, I believe the information was emailed to all residents and we posted a notice on the community bulletin board near the pool. We had to pass it swiftly due to urgent environmental reasons." Her voice projected confident authority, as though nobody should dare question her. "Any further discussion about this can be handled offline." I pressed further. "The original bylaws explicitly allowed fishing. Don't we need a full community vote to overturn that? By my reading of the rules, any major change requires a majority of homeowners' votes, not just the board's decision." Several people in the room shifted in their chairs, indicating they were curious or perhaps supportive but hesitant to speak. Karen dismissed my point, claiming that certain situations involving environmental protection fell under the board's purview to decide unilaterally. I suspected that was nonsense, but before I could say more, Karen brushed my question aside and moved the meeting forward. I glanced around the audience, hoping for support. A couple of people looked at me sympathetically, but nobody spoke up. It was clear that Karen had an intimidating presence, either through her personal alliances or a reputation that made residents wary of challenging her in a public forum. At the end of the meeting, I approached her in a last-ditch effort to talk one-on-one. She smiled politely but icily and said, "I understand your frustration, Mr. Barlow, but we have to uphold our community standards. If fishing is important to you, you could always try a public lake outside of our development. We can't have lines and hooks tangling in a place people pay to keep pristine." Then she turned on her heel and walked away, leaving me standing there, fists clenched at my sides. On my way out, a tall man with glasses hurried to catch up with me. He introduced himself as Dave from the next street over. He'd overheard my questions and said, "There are quite a few of us who don't agree with these bans. Would you be willing to meet and talk sometime?" I nodded, grateful for any ally in this mess. Dave said he'd be in touch. That Sunday, Dave invited me to his home. I found him seated at his dining table with two other neighbors, Lucy, an environmental scientist who worked at a local lab, and Hector, a retired police officer. They welcomed me with coffee and an air of camaraderie I hadn't felt since moving here. Lucy wasted no time diving into her concerns. "I've tested the water in that lake, and it's not the fishing that's damaging it. It's the excess fertilizer from lawns that runs off into the water, fueling algae growth. Karen claims banning fishing helps the environment, but she's ignoring the real culprit." Hector added, "I've tried to talk to her about suspicious activity on the board's finances. She just brushed me off. Then I got a violation notice for my boat trailer being in the driveway, something that was fine for years. I smell corruption, but I can't prove it yet." I shared my own experiences, from the nonsense fine to the way she silenced me at the meeting. We brainstormed possible reasons Karen would want to clamp down on fishing. Lucy suggested that maybe she wanted to reduce foot traffic near the lake to make it appear more private for potential buyers. Hector hypothesized that Karen might have an inside arrangement with the town council to redevelop part of the lakeshore. Dave believed the ban was a stepping stone to push out families who didn't conform to her idea of an upscale community. That speculation lit a fire in me. I offered to dig into real estate records and financial statements that might show if Karen or her associates were maneuvering to acquire the land around the lake. With my background in finance, I knew how to trace property transactions and identify suspicious shell companies if they existed. The four of us formed a pact to share whatever we discovered, vow to protect each other from retaliation, and figure out how to stand up to Karen's stranglehold. During the next week, I spent my free hours online, researching property deeds, looking for any sign that the lake or the surrounding lots were up for sale. Lakeshore Greens was originally developed by a company called Shoreline Horizons, which still had partial ownership of some facilities. The lake, specifically, was under a long-term lease to the HOA, but I spotted notes in the county register showing that the lease was due to expire in under a year. That made me think, if Karen or her allies had their sights set on acquiring full ownership of the lake, they could rewrite the rules altogether, ignoring any resident input. I also learned that the main investor in Shoreline Horizons was seeking to liquidate assets due to financial troubles. That left an opening for outside buyers to swoop in. The more I investigated, the more it seemed plausible that Karen might be angling to purchase the lake at a bargain price, and then either develop expensive waterfront properties or turn it into a private club. If so, banning fishing would be just the first step toward restricting public access. She could drive out any neighbors who opposed her, then shape the community into a profitable enterprise. As I pieced this together, I felt a swell of anger at the thought of my daughter's memory of her mother being undermined by corporate greed and HOA manipulation. But it also lit a spark of determination. If there was a chance to thwart Karen's plan, I wanted to seize it. That meant forging alliances among the residents, exposing her motives, and potentially taking advantage of the developer's financial vulnerability. During this time, June became more anxious. She noticed me hunched over spreadsheets and legal documents late into the night. One evening, she gently asked, "Dad, is this about that fine we got for fishing?" Her eyes were wide with concern. I sighed and nodded, explaining that I couldn't stand by and watch the neighborhood devolve into a petty dictatorship. She pursed her lips, then surprised me by saying, "I miss Mom too. And fishing with you was the one thing that made me feel like she was still here." That reminder fueled my resolve further. I promised her that I wouldn't let Karen rob us of that connection, no matter what it took. The following week, Dave called, sounding urgent. "Karen's hosting some fancy dinner event for the HOA board and a few city officials at the clubhouse. I've caught wind that the topic might be the future of the lake." He invited me to tag along in the capacity of hospitality volunteer, which was apparently something Karen's events used for setup and cleanup help. "It'll be easier to blend in that way. Maybe we'll overhear something," Dave explained. I was nervous about infiltration, but my curiosity outweighed my hesitation. That Saturday, we arrived at the clubhouse wearing matching polo shirts that identified us as volunteers. It wasn't unusual for neighbors to pitch in at community events, though Karen typically handpicked her volunteers from among her loyal supporters. Dave had managed to get us on the list by claiming we'd help with decorations and ushering. Indeed, we spent the first hour arranging centerpieces on round tables and making sure the dinner area looked pristine. While we worked, Karen sailed in, giving orders to everyone, flitting around in a fitted blazer and pencil skirt. She barely registered my presence, too busy micromanaging details of the menu and seating chart. Once the event started, we pretended to tidy up and refill water glasses. I stayed near a corner, close to the city officials, an older man in a suit who was on the planning commission and a woman from the local zoning board. Karen joined them at one point, swirling her wine and speaking in hushed tones. I caught snippets of conversation, references to rezoning requests, modifications to the community plan, talk of streamlining the acquisition process. My heart pounded as I realized they were discussing the possibility of turning the lakeshore into prime real estate. The official from the Planning Commission seemed receptive, nodding and remarking that if the HOA had firm control over the lake, it could expedite approval for private development. Karen insisted that limiting recreational activities on the lake would help preserve its pristine condition, a phrase that had become her go-to justification. They then joked about how some residents complained about losing the right to fish, and Karen made a dismissive comment about those types not understanding property values. It was condescending, dripping with the sort of elitism that made my blood boil. I wanted to march right up to her and challenge every word, but I forced myself to stay calm and continue eavesdropping, hoping to pick up more concrete clues. Dave, meanwhile, hovered near the door, pretending to greet late arrivals. After about 30 minutes of listening, I had heard enough to confirm my suspicions. Karen was working behind the scenes to secure a path for redeveloping the lake area once the lease ended. She seemed confident that with enough city officials in her pocket, she could bypass any community outcry. The ban on fishing was simply the first visible step in her broader strategy. On our way out, Dave and I exchanged a knowing glance. We didn't speak until we were safely outside, walking away from the clubhouse. Then I whispered, "We have to let the others know. She's not just fining people. She's setting this place up for a total overhaul." Dave agreed, determined to spread the word to Lucy and Hector. The question was how to turn knowledge into action. By now, I felt the burden of time pressing down on me. Karen was forging alliances at City Hall. The developer was likely close to selling. If I wanted to protect the lake, I had to move quickly. I began contacting old colleagues in the real estate world, people I trusted to keep a secret. One of them, Mike, was a property attorney who owed me a favor. When I explained the situation and the possibility that Shoreline Horizons was looking to sell, he confirmed that he'd heard rumors about them shedding assets to avoid bankruptcy. The lake, though small, was valuable enough to attract interest from local investors. Mike teased out a possibility. If you can gather the capital, you might outmaneuver Karen by making an offer on that lake yourself. The idea was audacious. Buy the lake directly, thereby stripping the HOA of control once the current lease expired. On the surface, it sounded insane, but ironically, I had the money. After my wife's passing, I sold our old home and used the insurance payout to secure a nest egg. I'd been planning to invest that in something stable for June's future. Maybe, just maybe, this was the key to not only safeguarding the lake, but also ensuring that it wouldn't end up in the clutches of someone who wanted to exploit it. However, the moral dilemma gnawed at me. Purchasing the lake would give me disproportionate power. Would I become as much of a tyrant as Karen? I confided this worry to Lucy, who countered that at least I wouldn't be motivated by profit or exclusivity. She pointed out that once I owned the lake, I could set up a community trust or a public easement that guaranteed open access under reasonable guidelines. If I didn't act, Karen would likely profit, pushing out anyone she deemed unfit for her perfect vision. The next week, I discreetly contacted Shoreline Horizons. Through an intermediary, I expressed interest in purchasing the lake property outright, offering a swift, all-cash deal. The developer's representative sounded intrigued, but mentioned another interested party. I bet my right hand that party was Karen. The rep said they'd need to see proof of funds, and they were looking to finalize the sale soon. That meant I had to move fast. I showed them my bank statements, which was sobering because it reminded me just how much I'd be risking for this cause. Yet if it meant preserving the lake and the essence of what my family needed, I was willing to do it. Meanwhile, Karen was stepping up her intimidation tactics. I received a second notice claiming that my porch light was too bright, violating the light pollution standards. Then, a letter arrived threatening to tow June's bicycle if it wasn't kept inside the garage overnight. Marcia and Hector reported similar harassment, along with newly minted restrictions about yard decorations and mailboxes. Every day, the HOA's list of petty rules seemed to grow. It was like Karen sensed our resistance and wanted to punish us into submission. The neighborhood atmosphere turned tense. Residents whispered about moving away, fearing endless fines. Some kept their heads down, hoping to avoid her scrutiny. And yet, a resistance was forming quietly. Lucy assembled a small group to gather water samples from the lake, proving that fertilizer runoff and not fishing was the genuine environmental hazard. Dave spoke to local journalists off the record, gauging their interest in a story about potential corruption and real estate collusion. Hector used his background as a police officer to double-check any legal boundaries Karen might be crossing. We were methodically building a case, though it was a delicate dance. If Karen discovered the extent of our work, she might accelerate her plans or try to ostracize us even more effectively. Then, a pivotal moment arrived. Shoreline Horizons accepted my purchase offer. I still recall the adrenaline that rushed through me when I got the call. They'd chosen my bid over the other interested party. Perhaps my willingness to close quickly, combined with the straightforward nature of an all-cash deal, swayed them. Or maybe they were wary of Karen's approach. Regardless, I was about to become the owner of the lake on paper, at least, contingent upon finalizing the contract and passing an environmental assessment. The sale had to remain confidential for at least 3 weeks as per the developer's request, which worked well for me, because I wanted to keep Karen in the dark until everything was official. For the next few days, I felt like I was living a double life. By day, I was the quiet financial consultant, receiving violation notices for trifling issues around my home. By night, I was orchestrating a plan to buy the very lake that Karen thought she could manipulate to her advantage. Mike helped me structure the paperwork so the property would be held in a limited liability company's name, partly to protect my own liability and partly to keep my involvement less obvious. I didn't want Karen or her city official cronies throwing obstacles at me before the deal closed. One evening, I was sitting at the kitchen table with June. She was doing her homework, and I was poring over the final contract details. She set down her pen and stared at me. "Dad, do you think we'll still live here in a year?" The question had an air of sorrow, as though she'd gotten used to the idea that maybe this place would be another temporary stop. I smiled, trying to sound confident. "I hope so. I'm doing everything I can to make sure we can stay and keep fishing and live peacefully without anyone telling us what we can or can't do at our own lake." She nodded, not entirely convinced, but at least not dismissive. I wanted to reassure her fully, but the truth was, I couldn't predict the war that might erupt once Karen found out I was upending her scheme. The big clash happened sooner than I anticipated. Karen announced a lake preservation gala, inviting city officials, potential investors, and selective residents she deemed worthy. It was, from the flyer she posted, a high-end social gathering, with wine tasting and catered hors d'oeuvres, aimed at celebrating the HOA's commitment to keeping the lake pristine. That was ironic, considering the environment was actually threatened by poor oversight of lawn chemicals, not a few fishing lines. I received no invitation, of course, but Dave, Lucy, and Hector got wind of it. They urged me to make an appearance anyway. After all, I was on track to own the lake. If I showed up unannounced, we might expose her ruse publicly. I decided to do just that, albeit quietly. On the night of the gala, I put on a casual blazer, took a deep breath, and headed over to the clubhouse, reminding myself to keep my cool. When I arrived, the place was buzzing with polite chatter and the clink of glasses. Karen was at the center, wearing a stylish cocktail dress, greeting everyone as if she were royalty. The moment she saw me, her eyes flickered with surprise, followed by annoyance. She plastered on a professional smile and approached. "Mr. Barlow, I didn't realize you had an RSVP." Her tone was cordial but carried an undercurrent of hostility. I shrugged with feigned nonchalance. "I wanted to see how we're preserving the lake. After all, I do like fishing there. Maybe there's hope you'll reconsider the ban." She gave a short, humorless laugh. "The ban is for the good of the community. If you cared about this neighborhood, you'd support it. I'm afraid you'll find no sympathy here." Her eyes darted past me to a tall man in a suit from the city council, so I sensed she didn't want a public scene. I decided not to push further in that moment, but I stayed, making small talk with other neighbors, gleaning more insights. People were either blissfully unaware of Karen's long-term plan or quietly hoping they'd somehow benefit from it. One man told me he heard rumor of fancy condos going up near the lake, which might raise property values. Another said Karen had implied she could guarantee an uptick in prices if they complied with her new rules. It was a tapestry of half-truths and manipulations. Near the end of the event, Karen tapped a spoon against her glass, calling for attention. She thanked everyone for coming and gave a speech about how the HOA was taking bold steps to ensure the lake remained the jewel of lakeshore greens, free from the nuisances of irresponsible usage. She never once mentioned fishing directly, but I could feel her barbs aimed in my direction. Then she praised the city officials for their support, hinting that once we have complete autonomy over the lake, we'll see improvements that benefit the entire community. That statement almost made me laugh out loud because I knew something she didn't. Her autonomy was about to vanish. The next morning, I got the call from Mike that the deal was officially done. I was now, through my LLC, the owner of the lake property, pending final recognition from the county. My immediate move was to deliver a legally binding notice to the HOA board, informing them that the lease for the lake would not be renewed at the end of its term, unless certain environmental and community demands were met. Specifically, they had to lift the fishing ban, address runoff pollution, and halt all arbitrary fines that extended beyond the original bylaws. I gave them 30 days to comply. If they refused, I held the right to terminate their usage of the lake entirely. I printed copies and had them delivered to each board member by certified mail, ensuring they'd all receive them simultaneously. Karen found out within hours, of course. That afternoon, while I was raking leaves in my front yard, she marched up the driveway in a near fury. She clutched the letter, her face flushed. "What on earth is this?" she demanded, voice trembling with rage. "You think you can just buy the lake and threaten the HOA? We have a valid lease in place." I took a breath to steady myself. "Yes, Karen, a lease that expires soon, and which you violated by banning fishing under false pretenses and ignoring real environmental issues. I've also discovered enough to show you've been selectively enforcing fines. So here's the deal. Fix it or lose your privileges." She pointed a finger at me. "You have no idea what you're getting into. I have allies in local government and I can make your life miserable. You think you're clever, but you're just being reckless." I shrugged. "I'm just standing up for what's right, for my daughter, for the people you've bullied, and for the future of this neighborhood. The lake belongs to me now, and I'll make sure it's managed with genuine respect for the environment and for all residents." Karen stalked off without another word, and I felt a strange mix of triumph and apprehension. June peered out from the doorway, wide-eyed. "Dad, is this really happening?" I nodded, telling her we'd talk inside. Once we were in the living room, I explained the entire sequence of events, from my hidden negotiations to the final purchase. She listened, tension visible in her shoulders, but eventually she gave me a small smile of appreciation. That evening, I met with Dave, Lucy, and Hector to strategize. The news had spread fast. Half the neighbors were thrilled that Karen's stronghold might be ending. The other half were confused or concerned about the potential chaos. Lucy insisted we handle it diplomatically, not stooping to Karen's level of bullying. Dave pointed out that we needed to reassure everyone we weren't going to fence off the lake. Hector suggested a big community meeting where we explained our plan to establish a fair set of guidelines allowing fishing again, as well as addressing real environmental concerns. Meanwhile, Karen wasn't sitting idle. Within days, she sent out a flurry of emails and official-looking letters, proclaiming that my actions were illegal, that the HOA's lease granted them unassailable rights for years to come, and that she'd sue to protect the community. She also ramped up petty fines on certain households, including mine, citing imaginary infractions like excessive yard clutter or improper sidewalk edging. It became comical how clearly targeted these notices were. However, I was prepared. Mike had armed me with a solid legal foundation, verifying that once the lease ended, or if the HOA was in breach, I could revoke their privileges. Additionally, Lucy's water tests provided scientific proof that the HOA had neglected real pollution issues. The ban on fishing, meanwhile, was shown to have no legitimate basis in improving water quality. If anything, the data suggested ignoring fertilizer runoff was the true danger. The tension reached a boiling point on a sunny Saturday when Karen tried to host a community appreciation barbecue by the lake. Several of us showed up, carrying documents that proved the lake was under my ownership. We politely but firmly informed the crowd that the HOA was not permitted to host official events on the property without addressing the environmental concerns and lifting the fishing ban. Karen was furious, berating us in front of stunned onlookers. Yet, to her surprise, a significant portion of the crowd sided with us. They'd grown weary of her endless rules. Many people packed up and left the barbecue, leaving Karen standing there with her inner circle, livid and isolated. Over the following week, reporters from the local newspaper caught wind of the drama. They reached out to both sides for comment. Karen tried to paint me as a reckless newcomer who purchased the lake for personal gain. I countered by explaining that I intended to create an open-access trust that allowed all residents to enjoy fishing, canoeing, and nature walks, provided we tackled the real pollution issues. My statement garnered sympathy. After all, I wasn't seeking profit. I simply wanted fairness and the preservation of a meaningful pastime for the community. Karen then tried leveraging city officials, hoping they'd declare the lake a protected zone that fell under her board's purview. But that attempt backfired when Lucy publicly presented her scientific findings, exposing the mismanagement. The city officials scrambled to avoid association with Karen's fiasco, leaving her without the political backup she'd relied on. During this phase, my biggest challenge was ensuring that neighbors understood I wasn't turning into a dictator, ironically replacing Karen with my own brand of tyranny. I organized a public forum at the local library, inviting everyone to ask questions and share opinions. I began by apologizing for the confusion and explained how I'd discovered the lease's pending expiration. Laid out my plan. Once the HOA recognized that the fishing ban was invalid and took steps to fix the fertilizer runoff, we'd co-create a new management agreement. That agreement would be transparent, with input from residents, and would guarantee the lake remained accessible to everyone. No exorbitant fees, no hidden amendments. June even spoke briefly, sharing how important fishing had been in her healing process since losing her mother. That personal testimony struck a chord with many attendees, who approached us afterward with words of support or gratitude. Not surprisingly, Karen didn't show up to the forum, though one of her loyalists did, a man named Cecil. He questioned my motives, suggesting that once I owned the lake fully, I could impose high charges for usage. I assured him that wasn't my intention. I'd sign a legally binding document with an oversight committee if needed. I wanted to remove any doubt that my plan was self-serving. He remained skeptical, but others appreciated the candor. A few days later, an unexpected development occurred. Shoreline Horizons filed for bankruptcy. That revealed how precarious their finances were. If Karen had been plotting to buy the lake directly from them, her opportunity had vanished. My purchase was the last major asset transfer they completed before going under. It also meant no one from the development company would come to her aid in claiming the lease was still valid. The entire tide shifted in my favor legally. Then came the last stand. Karen attempted a Hail Mary. She orchestrated a meeting of the HOA board, presumably to vote on some draconian measure that would label me a hostile entity and forcibly exclude me from any community resources. But I was 2 steps ahead. Lucy, Dave, and Hector, along with several other neighbors, attended that meeting, armed with documentation proving the board's repeated breaches of the original bylaws, the lease violations, and the suspect amendments passed without due process. They demanded Karen step down from the presidency or face a class action lawsuit from residents. Caught off guard by the overwhelming evidence, half her board allies wavered, some even resigning on the spot to avoid further complicity. With her power base crumbling, Karen stood at the head of the table, fists clenched, voice shaking. She railed about how the neighborhood was going to fall apart under my reckless ownership and how she'd tried to protect property values. She accused us of sabotage, painting herself as a tragic hero, but no one was buying it. By the end of the night, the board members had collectively agreed to remove Karen from her position. She stormed out, cursing under her breath. That was the turning point. Over the next week, a transitional committee formed to oversee the HOA, They revoked the fishing ban officially. I honored my promise and allowed open lake access under a set of sensible guidelines. No littering, limit on daily catches, mandatory safe disposal of hooks, and an actual plan to address fertilizer runoff. The stress that had plagued the community lifted. People started fishing again. Kids splashed near the shore and a few kayak enthusiasts even returned. June and I went to the lake at sunset on one of those days, casting our lines in the water. She looked happier than she had in months. I felt a warmth in my chest, recalling how her mother always said that water had the power to heal. Karen tried to rattle a few more sabers, filing a complaint with the city, claiming the new arrangement was illegal, but the city wasn't interested. They'd gotten enough negative press about her backroom dealings, and no one wanted to take her side. A local journalist wrote an article titled, "The HOA Power Struggle: How One Resident Bought the Lake and Ended a Tyranny," which painted a sympathetic picture of my actions while noting the complex undertones of the entire situation. The final outcome of Karen's attempts at retribution fizzled when the transitional committee circulated a petition among residents seeking to permanently remove Karen and her staunch loyalists from any leadership or decision-making roles. A majority signed willingly. Karen was effectively ostracized, though she still owned her house. With her influence gone, she put her property up for sale a few months later, apparently wanting a fresh start elsewhere. It was rumored she suffered significant financial losses from her failed attempt to purchase the lake, but few people felt sorry for her. Meanwhile, I took steps to place the lake in a trust managed by the newly reformed HOA and a rotating board of resident volunteers. While legally I maintained ownership, I signed a contractual agreement that guaranteed public usage rights to every homeowner in the community, ensuring no single person could replicate Karen's tyranny. We also formed an environmental subcommittee to tackle the fertilizer issues thoroughly, with Lucy at the helm, and saw tangible improvements in the water quality over time. In the months that followed, the atmosphere in Lakeshore Greens transformed. Neighbors who had been too scared to voice concerns began participating in open forums. Yard sale weekends flourished without some bizarre permit requirement. Kids played in the street again, not terrified that some new rule would forbid them from riding scooters. I received multiple thank you notes, some from people I barely knew, expressing relief that they no longer felt watched or bullied by arbitrary fines. And what of June and me? We found a sense of home here, ironically cemented by conflict. She joined a small environmental club at her high school, inspired by Lucy's approach to sustaining the lake. She made new friends who would come over to fish or paddle along the shore in the afternoons. It was a sight that made me smile, a reminder that sometimes adversity can bring out the best in a community. One afternoon, we were both sitting on the dock, rods in hand, waiting for a bite. June turned to me and asked, "Dad, do you regret spending all that money on the lake?" I gazed at the water rippling softly in the breeze and thought of everything that had happened. Then I shook my head. We have a safe place to cast our lines and remember your mom. We helped a neighborhood stand up to someone who was abusing her power. That's worth every penny. June nodded thoughtfully, looking out at the lake. "Sometimes I think Mom can see us. I think she'd be proud," she whispered. A gentle silence followed. Tears pricked my eyes, but they were a soft, comforting kind of tears. In that moment, the lake felt sacred. It wasn't just a body of water. It was a testament to resilience, community, and the memory of a woman we both loved deeply. By the one-year anniversary of those tumultuous events, Lakeshore Greens had undergone a peaceful renaissance. A new HOA board had formed, adopting transparent voting processes, term limits for board positions, and open financial records. I attended a few of their meetings, proud to see everyday residents stepping into leadership roles with genuine care for their neighbors. Karen was a distant memory, reduced to the occasional story people whispered about the time we almost lost our lake. Some residents approached me about running for an official board position. I respectfully declined, explaining that my role was better served as a steward of the trust, not as a politician. I did, however, happily volunteer to help plan the first annual Lakeshore Festival, an event celebrating fishing, kayaking, local arts, and environmental awareness. June worked alongside me, brainstorming ways to honor her mother's love of nature. We ended up dedicating a small picnic area to her memory, a plaque that read, "For those who find peace in these waters." When festival day arrived, the place was alive with laughter and community spirit. Families from all corners of Lakeshore Green shared in the joy of a bright future shaped by cooperation, not fear. For a moment, I felt a surreal sense of gratitude. It's amazing how one spark, like a petty $500 fine, can ignite a fire that reshapes an entire landscape. If Karen had never tried to ban fishing, perhaps I would have quietly gone along, never stepping up to fight for what I believed in. That night, as I helped tear down canopies and pack up leftover supplies, I watched June hold a small group of kids enthralled with her fishing stories, telling them how to use certain lures, explaining that it had once been illegal to cast a line here thanks to an overbearing HOA. The kids were wide-eyed, some of them not even old enough to remember the conflict. For them, the lake had always been a place of fun and friendship, and in that I found a sense of healing. We'd effectively erased a legacy of intimidation and replaced it with an ethos of openness. Of course, no place is perfect. Problems still crop up, but they're handled through respectful dialogue rather than mandates from on high. The difference now is that people aren't afraid to voice their concerns. If anything, the turmoil taught us how fragile communities can be when those in power act without accountability. Yet it also showed that a single individual, backed by truth, determination, and the willingness to stand up for neighbors, can make a difference. Sometimes, I still receive the occasional side-eye from folks who believe I was too radical, that I should have followed the rules instead of buying the lake outright. I understand their perspective, maybe there was another path, but at the end of the day, I can't bring myself to regret the outcome. We have a thriving neighborhood, a healthier lake, and a future unburdened by oppressive micromanagement. That's a victory I'll hold close for a long time. A few times a month, I trek down to the water just before dusk, a fishing rod in one hand, a small tackle box in the other. Sometimes June tags along, other times she's busy with her friends, so I go alone. But I'm never truly alone there. The memory of my wife lingers, the last sunlight glinting off the ripples, and each gentle splash of fish feels like a quiet reassurance that we made the right choices. In those tranquil moments, I think about how the community came together to dethrone a bully and reclaim something precious. I realize that, in its own way, the story of Lakeshore Greens is a testament to why we stand up to wrongdoing, and how adversity can lead us to something unexpectedly beautiful.